We are glad that you are here. Of course, it's a weekend where we remember those who have given their lives for our freedom. It's already been mentioned at least once this morning. And just reflecting on that, I was thinking this week, for a lot of us, we grow up in our homes and we go to school. And even if you're good at school, a lot of people look forward to the summer break. And then you look forward to graduating from school, and it just seems like you're free and now you can move on with your life. And by the way, kids still in school, it doesn't always get easier. It's just different. But you think about, now I've got my whole life ahead of me. And yet there are those that basically as soon as they got out of school, they were in the military. Today we have many young people that volunteer to enlist. But of course, years ago, there were many that were drafted, which means you didn't exactly choose this for yourself. But then we also realized that some of those young men, we would say, had a whole life ahead of them that kind of went through the hard part of getting through school. Now they've got their whole life. And then they're dead. Serving in the military. And I realize there's a big difference between people who enlist and people that are drafted, but the people who enlist decide, this is what I want to do. And surely in their mind, they've got to say, this is a cause worth dying for. We know not everyone in the military dies, but they know it could happen. And so they're willing to take a stand. They're willing to make a sacrifice. They're willing to say, I'm going to put my life on the line. I'm certainly going to put my time and my effort and my energy and maybe even my youth on the line, even if you just serve and maybe never even see combat. But you're willing to stand up for something that you believe in, something that's right, something that's true, something that's worth dying for. And ultimately, we would say that's our freedom. Because if we're not going to be fighting for freedom, then let's just surrender. And, I'm not saying it would be enjoyable for if we all just became, like, for instance, communists. Let's just, did anybody ever said that in church before? Let's just surrender to the Chinese, But no, we're going to stand up and say, no, we don't want to surrender. When we think about all the lives that have been lost over the years to get where we are today, why would we ever give that up? So we are thankful for the people that died. And sometimes, certainly in November, we say those people that have served, maybe you could let us know who else served in the past. But today it's not really about those people that served, it's those people that died. I wonder if you have a family member or a close friend, so this would have been years ago probably, but it could have been more recent time, that have died in military service. Would you raise your hand? Right. And I know probably a lot of people that have served in the past, you had people beside you, friends and fellow soldiers that died while you were serving. And so we appreciate those people that gave that great sacrifice. And we want to think about kind of this spiritual war that's going on. So Alex just led the song, Soldiers of Christ Arise. It's just reminding us that there's a spiritual battle between good and evil, of righteousness and wickedness, about God and Satan, about the kingdom of this world and the kingdom of heaven. And it is a battle. It's not a battle physically. Paul said in Ephesians chapter 6, it's not flesh and blood. It's spiritual. It's principalities. It's spiritual forces. It's the spirit of the world and the spirit of wickedness against the power of God. And we know in the first century, and even beyond that, even in our day, there are people that are willing to take a stand, to say, I'm going to follow Christ no matter what. And the reading today, I did read through it before we came here, but as it was being read, and then Sean just kind of ended it, and I kind of thought, maybe we could have gone a few verses later, because it just seemed so discouraging, you know, because it's talking about these people that had great faith. So Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 talks about people that have this kind of conviction, something that's worth taking a stand, something that's worth dying for, something I'm going to give my life for. And sometimes even living faithfully to Christ is more difficult than dying for him. Because living is every day. Living is, not only do I have to overcome now, but I have to go overcome tomorrow and next week and next year. It just goes on. Sometimes the challenges are difficult. But he's saying this is what faith is. Faith is the assurance, being sure, being certain, I know this is for sure. God's promises. Of God's will and God's plan. And I can be sure no matter what happens, God is with me. I can be sure that I will have victory. It may not be always the victory that I think ought to happen. It's not always something that I have pre-thought in my mind. But there's always victory in Christ no matter what. And it's a conviction of things not seen. So it could be the not seen as the spiritual world. It could be the not seen that's not yet even happened yet. It could be tomorrow or next week, but things that have not even transpired, but I can have faith in God. He's going to be with me. And so that's the whole book of Hebrews, and it goes through a whole list of names, right? Starting with Abel, who was killed because he was faithful to God, and goes all the way through talking about great warriors, faithful prophets, kings, and people that went through difficult times. It talks about men and women, those people that were free and those people that were slaves, those people that were rich and others that were poor. Some people lived a life of honor and other of dishonor. And some people were public, the prophets, and other people were more private in their taking a stand for the Lord. These are the faithful people. And by the time we get through chapter 11, we end in chapter 12, beginning in verse 1, where it reminds us, therefore, since we as Christians, he's talking to the believers, and they're going through persecution. And he even goes on to say in the next chapter that they've not even resisted to this point of shedding blood, but they've been faithful. And since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of these faithful, chapter 11, witnesses, people that have gone on before, we are to continue to run the race. We are to free ourselves of all the things that distract us and tear us down, and we're to be committed to what God has for us. So what I do want to do is just look at a little bit at the last few verses of Hebrews 11, because it seems like, okay, it's the chapter of faith. And we like going through all the people that we're familiar with, and we know exactly what happened. And, it's kind of like saying things went fairly well for them. Like Noah, he was saved. Abraham, he was delivered. And even his son Isaac was delivered. And he was the man of the faith. And then there was Moses, and he was led by God. And, it just goes on and on about David and Samson and just all these people. And they saw victory in their life. But you want to know something? Not everyone saw the victory like we would define success. Some of them went through great challenges and great things that were trying to destroy them and tear them down and rip them away from being faithful to God. So near the end of the chapter, verse 33 of Hebrews 11, and the idea is here he's not listing names anymore. He's listing people that have been through things, and sometimes we can put names to it, though, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions. So, we may think of Daniel there. Or quenched the power of the fire. We may think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, and put foreign armies to flight. So and I think maybe why he doesn't list them is because maybe there's many people that went through that. It's kind of like being thrown to the lions. It's not like in Daniel's day they said, let's come up with something brand new. That was a common way of killing criminals, right? Even up to the day when the apostles, which was hundreds of years after Daniel, but even some of the apostles were thrown to the lions. So, Daniel was not the only one. And maybe those that were thrown into the fire. We know that early church persecution, and historians tell us that some of the The faithful disciples, Christians of Christ, were burned at the stake. But then he goes on to say, we think about this and we think about people standing up. These are, like we would say, warriors for Christ. There were soldiers on the battlefield. And it's not a physical war. It was a spiritual war. They were trying to teach people about God's will and his plan, about calling even God's people back to the Lord. And the people were so unwilling and they were resistant. And they ended up hating the preachers of good news. They hated the prophets that were warning of a destruction to come if they didn't repent. They ended up persecuting the prophets. And sometimes we would say they were torturing them and sometimes even killing them because they were simply telling people about God's plan for their life. And they hated it so much. But then we go on to a different kind of a list. And here's the list. Some women received their dead by resurrection. And some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might rise again to a better life. And others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains, imprisonment. They were stoned, and they were sawn in two, and they were killed with the sword. Challenges, sometimes we don't get far enough in Hebrews to read stuff like this. Maybe we would prefer not to, because it doesn't seem very happy. We like the Abraham and Moses and the David, where things seem to work. Their life wasn't easy. You just got to read back in the Old Testament. And their challenges too. But when we read things like this, it's kind of like, why does that happen? I mean, these people are faithful to God, and they're willing to say, I'm going to die if I need to. And God says, if to die will bring me glory, then you will die. What a challenge that is. So think about it. Think about Acts chapter 12. Acts chapter 12. So here's a really great story. So Peter's in prison. And Herod has decided that he's going to kill some Christians and he's going to run them through the sword, but probably it means beheading, killed with the sword. And so Peter's kind of up on the next day going to be executed. The Christians start praying. An angel comes, opens the doors of the cells. He walks out of the prison, goes and meets with the disciples. He doesn't die that day, that week, that year, even that decade. Isn't that fabulous? I mean, what a great story. A great story about deliverance. And a great story we take such comfort that God delivers his people. That's the kind of God I want to serve. He delivers his people. Faithful people. But it's only a few verses earlier because it's the same chapter. We've got James. Remember him? He's a disciple. You remember Peter, Andrew, James, and John? You remember Peter, James, and John are the three that were the closest to Jesus. Mount of Transfiguration. They were there when the girl was resurrected from the dead. They were there when Jesus was praying in the garden. It was the three, and one of them was James. I mean, James was a faithful disciple. Oh, he too was arrested, by the way. And he too was going to be persecuted and executed and beheaded. And it happened that day. What happened? One man lives and one man dies in the same chapter, probably in the same week of the church. Well, God has plans sometimes and allows some people to go through suffering, to go through persecution, to go through imprisonment, or sometimes even to go through the death. John the Baptist is another example we know in the New Testament, a faithful follower of God and proclaiming that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, pointing people to Jesus, preparing the way that people would be repenting and their hearts would be stirred and to be prepared when Jesus came, they would be able to accept him. And yet he also died by the sword. beheaded. Good people like that, faithful people. Why does that happen? And the interesting thing is, most of those people, they didn't even have to die. They didn't have to die. Because they could have easily just said, I deny Christ. I'm not going to follow him anymore. I'm not going to keep preaching. I'm going to keep my mouth shut. And they probably would have been released. If you remember, even the Apostle Paul said that's what he used to do to the Christians before he became a Christian. He used to go around persecuting the disciples. He used to go around, and what he would say is, he put them in prison, and he put some to death. But he also says, I try to force them to blaspheme, which means this. I'm going to put you in prison, I'm going to torture you, I'm going to put you to death, but if you deny Christ, I'll let you go. You'll be free. And they could have decided to do that, but they didn't. They said, I will never deny the one who saved me. I'll never deny the one who loves me more than life itself. I'll never deny the one who went to the cross for my sins. I'll never deny the one that was resurrected from the tomb and lives in heaven. I'm never going to deny my Lord and my Master. And they said, well, then you've chosen death. They knew they were going to die, and they still went through it. Why? And we kind of go back to the Memorial Day thing with people that died in a physical battle here in this world in the last 200 years. That they went into battle knowing they could die. Because it was something they believed in. It was something they said, this is worth dying for. And that's what the disciples and the apostles and the Christians did to say, it's worth dying for. And through that, God was honored. Through that, people were brought to Christ. Through that, the gospel continued to be spread not only in the region of Judea and Jerusalem, but into all the known world as the disciples went out. Some were tortured, this says the second verse, some were tortured refusing to accept release. They said, no, I'm going to stand my ground, I'm going to remain firm, I'm going to be faithful to the Lord because I love him and he loves me. People willing to take that kind of conviction, and that's what Paul did as well. As we look at these verses, you have to remember this is written by Paul. Paul was the one who's persecuting the church, and we just talked about him, about what he tried to do to the Christians. And yet when he became a Christian, look what happened to him. He went from being the one who was persecuting to the one who was persecuted. He was the one who went from trying to get people to deny Christ, and now people are trying to force him to deny Christ. People who he wanted dead because they were preaching Christ, now he's preaching Christ, and there's many people that want Paul dead. Kind of a complete reversal of the roles. If we live to the Lord. And if we die to the Lord. So whether we live or we die, we are the Lord's. So Paul says, if I live, that's good. If I die, that's good too. The next verse actually says, if I die, it's even better. It's better for me because I'm going to go to heaven where everything's great. I mean, this world is good. Heaven is great. This world is nice. Heaven is awesome. It's like, where do you want to live? And even as Christians, sometimes we can get so attached to the world. We're so, ingrained in the world. It's like, I just couldn't imagine leaving the world. It's like, man, I can't imagine staying here much longer. I just want to go. I just, I know some people go on extravagant vacations. I was trying to get the first word out. Can't remember the one. Vacations. See, it's complicated, but anyway. And you look forward to it, and you plan it, and you go, and you enjoy it, and then maybe you don't even really want to come home because it's just so wonderful. Well, heaven is going to be like millions of times better than that. And it's kind of like, well, Yeah, that big vacation that we spent all the money and all the time planning, and everybody says it's going to be great, and I'm not even sure if I want to go anymore. It's like, you don't do that. You're like, just anticipation grows as the time gets closer. And some of us are more closer than others to that time where we'll be in heaven, right? Paul says in Philippians chapter 1, it's my eager expectation and hope that I will not be ashamed, but with full courage now, as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. He's saying, when Paul's alive, he can go out and preach and teach and encourage and help people and instruct people and try to help the new Christians and try to help others to know about Christ so they can become Christians. I mean, that's what his whole life, that's what his world was about. He was committed to serve the Lord. And he's saying, if that glorifies God, that's what I live for. But if God's going to be glorified by my death, however that would be, however my death would be, whether it would be something that would be torture or execution or happen sooner than later, if that glorifies and honors God, if that's good for his kingdom, if that's even better for his kingdom than me to live, that's good. I'm all for that. I'm committed to that. It's not just like, oh God, if you really need to, it's like reluctantly you get a small yes from me. He's like, fabulous. To die is gain. To live is gain, to die is gain. To stay and work for God's glory. If I die, for God's glory. Either way, God gets glorified. That's all that's important. That's the most important thing. So that's the kind of life he lives, that it's not my life anyway. I've already given it to the Lord, and how I'm going to live or die, and when I'm going to live or die, that's God's plan. So he says something similar in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. He's talking about his own life as well as the people that are working with him. I don't think everyone was going through this because not everybody was that faithful in the first century. Like listen to what he's saying and consider who he's writing to. He's writing to the Corinthian church, which it would be almost indisputable to say they were one of the most worldly, unfaithful, messed up church. You think your church is messed up? Not like this. I mean, they just had, whatever you think could go wrong in a church, they did it, and they had it. Whether it's a moral issue or a fellowship issue or a doctrinal issue or about who is God and who is Jesus and what are we supposed to be doing, like they had everything wrong. But look what he says to them. This is the church that's kind of really messed up. And maybe he's saying if we focus more on what God has called us to, maybe we wouldn't have so many problems in the church. And we wouldn't have so many moral issues in the church. We wouldn't have so much division in the church. We wouldn't have so much false teaching in the church because everybody would be like, I just want to serve the Lord. We're just going to go full on doing what God's called us to. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. We're perplexed, but not driven to despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. And struck down, but not destroyed. Always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifest in our bodies. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifest in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you. And Paul says that many times, basically just saying, I've already given my life to Christ, and guess what? I've died. Now, physically, we know he's still alive when he was writing this. He's still alive. But he's saying, I've died to myself. I've died to my dreams and my wishes and my hopes. I've died to everything that this world has to offer. I'm just living for God. I'm going to serve him all the days of my life. I mean, do you ever wonder sometimes, you read about the life of Paul, the book of Acts, all these letters he wrote, and you kind of thought, I wonder what Paul had for a retirement plan. Right? He's like, I'm not retiring. I'm going to go till the day I die. Because that's what he said, my life is not mine. My life is not mine to enjoy. But if you ever ask Paul, you can ask him when you get to heaven. I'm pretty sure this is what he's going to say. I don't want to speak for him, but I will. If you say, Paul, but if you weren't living for yourself, then you didn't really have any joy in your life. He'd be like, no, I had lots of joy in my life because it was a joy for me to follow the Lord. It was a joy for me to serve the Lord. It was a joy for me to honor the Lord. That's where I got my joy. Oh, but Paul, all these things that happened to you, you must not have had peace in your life. There's always turmoil, struggles, and problems. Oh, but peace of Christ filled my life. And I knew he was going to be with me, and it's all going to work out according to his plan and his promises. I just surrendered it to God. Now, Paul even says, yes, sometimes we have these inner conflicts, and sometimes he had concerns or even worries. You know what he worried about? He wasn't so much worried about the economy. He wasn't worried about the political system. He wasn't worried about, where he's going to get the meal or where he's going to stay or what about the clothes. He was worried about the people in the churches. Maybe it's a strong word, you're not supposed to worry, but very concerned, intensely concerned. He struggled in prayer for the people, that they would be faithful, that they would serve God, that they would to know the will of God. And they would serve him all the days of their lives. That's what was on his heart. That's who his life became. So he's saying, yeah, going through a lot of difficult, challenging times, but I've given that to the Lord. And if this honors God, then so be it. I mean, Paul wanted to go to Rome, and maybe at some point, Paul's in Jerusalem. He had just gotten back there after his third missionary journey. Gets back to Jerusalem and says, I'm not really sure how I'm going to get to Rome. It's going to cost some money. There's going to have to be a voyage. And so I really want to go to Rome. And so God said, don't worry, Paul. I got it. So Paul's arrested. And Rome paid for Paul to get on ships, to be escorted, and to even have guards. It's kind of interesting. It's strange, right? Because everybody thought, Paul's being arrested, and he has guards taking him to Rome. Are they afraid Paul's going to escape? Probably not. Paul's like, these guards aren't to keep me from running away. These guards are to keep those guys out there from killing me. Like, this is God's plan. I've got my own protection detail. And God's got it all figured out. But I don't have money to pay for it, so we'll get Rome to pay for it. But he ends up in Rome. And then he ends up in jail. And he's able to influence people that are guards in the jail. And it says he even influenced, and some people became Christians that were members of Caesar's household. Like, do you really think that Paul, in the first century, could have gone in Rome on a door-knocking campaign and gone up to Pharaoh's house, rang the doorbell, and said, I'm going door to door to tell people about Jesus. Can I come for a sin? That's not going to happen. But when he's a prisoner, somehow it worked out that he met some people that were on the inner workings of Caesar's entourage. He's able to teach them the gospel. They become Christians, and guess what? He's got his foot in the door. Maybe he can never go there himself, but he can tell these people, when you go, this is what you see, this is what you do. You have faith in God, you have conviction, you have courage. God's going to be with you. You go and start teaching some more people in the palace. It's going to happen. God's got to figure it out. So Paul says, not a big deal. I've surrendered it. Persecution, yes. Death looming, yes. Uncertain of what tomorrow holds, yes. Full confidence in God. Because if I'm dead tomorrow, I'm in heaven. It does not get better than that. But if I live, I continue to work for the Lord. And that's a pretty good thing to be doing while you're here on the earth. This is what Paul was thinking. This is what his life was given to, that he would be faithful to God. The book of Revelation. Again, writing to churches that are struggling with a lot of different issues going on. And this is what Jesus said. Do not fear what you're about to suffer. It's going to get difficult. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested for 10 days, and you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. That's interesting, because this is written to the churches in Asia Minor, so not Jerusalem, not Rome. It's kind of a lot of the churches that Paul went to. This was written by John, not Paul, but it's a lot of those churches in Ephesus and Philippi and that area. They're going through a lot of struggles. Jerusalem had already been destroyed. So he's not talking about that kind of persecution. Now there's even more persecution coming. He said, don't you worry. Just trust in God, be faithful in him. And if you're faithful till death. And when we read that, sometimes we think, well, if I'm faithful until the day I die. Well, it may be, that's very important. I'm going to be faithful till the day I die. But what if it means you got to be faithful even when death is on your doorstep? Somebody is saying, if you don't deny Christ and recant your confession, if you don't do that, you're going to die today. Be faithful. Be faithful even in the face of death. And I will give you a crown of life, a reward. I'll give you heaven. I'll give you a new home. I'll give you a new body. I'll give you all the peace and all the joy. I will give you your life in the love of God. That's what we live for, being faithful even to the point of death. We're going to sing a song, Lamb of God. Jesus died. He suffered. He went through persecution. He went through rejection. He went through humiliation, through mocking. He went through it to the point where all his friends, his disciples, like these are the guys he'd been with 3 years, they all left. He's alone. The closest one he had was John, perhaps, but everyone else is gone. He went through suffering for us. And I think that's what's in Paul's mind. Jesus suffered for me. I can suffer for him if need be. It doesn't mean we always have to suffer. But if it comes up, I'm going to be faithful. Just like Jesus was faithful to the Father's will. He prayed, not my will, but your will be done. That's pretty heavy, I know. That's, like, so if this is your first time at church, or maybe, you don't know that much about Christianity, it's like, wow, that's a pretty big commitment to make, right? So we kind of say, hey, if you want to become a Christian today, so what are we saying? We're saying, if you want to be a Christian today, you come up and you say, today I'm ready to die. I'm ready to die to myself, to my plans, and to my goals, and I'm going to surrender it all to Christ. Now, when you walk out the door, you still have your family, you still have your job, you still have your neighbors, you still have people you need to love. So, you still have what you have, but you just see it all differently. It's all now through the lens of Christ. I'm going to die to myself. And if need be, I would die, or I'd suffer, or I'd be persecuted because I'm a Christian. And in the first century, the people knew that's what it was, because they knew the Christians everywhere were suffering. To be a Christian meant I'm going to suffer. Well, today, it's worth it. It's worth it. That's kind of where we get back to the very beginning, about a soldier that goes into the war thinking he may die, but he says it's worth the fight. It's worth standing. It's worth dying for. That's what we're saying about Christ. It's worth it to serve him, to love him, to honor him, to follow him. If today you're ready to make that decision to become a Christian, if you want to be baptized today into Christ and start that new life, we'll stand, we'll sing this song. Let us know how we can be a blessing to you this morning.